Hello there. This will be a follow-up to my response to Confused Matthew's Back to the Future 2 review, as I've gotten a few comments from people since I made the response. For the most part, people seem to have liked the response. A few people don't seem to like how quiet my voice is, and I apologise for that. I just naturally have a soft voice. However, if you turn the volume up on your speakers, you should be able to hear me. It's not ideal, I admit, but I think you can cope. Some people have told me that I have not really addressed the real reasons that some people consider Part 2 to be a bad film. Well, keep in mind, I am not reviewing the film, I am responding to a review. I completely understand that Confused Matthew's complaints about the film are not the only complaints anyone has ever had about the film, but I can't address any other problems with the film unless you tell me what they are. So if you do have a problem with Back to the Future Part 2, that Confused Matthew did not mention in his review, feel free to mention it in the comments and I will do my best to address it. I also recently noticed a comment from Confused Matthew's brother Stan about the film. This is what he said. Part 2 is unnecessarily confusing. The first and third don't really have much to do with time travel. The first is about Marty seeing his parents as kids, and the third is about romance and responsibility. Part 2 is just a wacky, clumsy time travel story. Well, I don't really know what he found confusing about Part 2. The basic plot is fairly straightforward. Marty and Doc go to the future, Biff steals the time machine while they're there and changes the past, so Marty and Doc have to go back to the past and fix things. That's all there is to the plot, really. I actually tried to contact Stan recently, after reading this comment, to try and find out what it was about the film that he found confusing, but so far no reply. As for it being more about time travel, is that really such a bad thing? Where does it say that a movie about time travel can't be good? And does it really have that much more to do with time travel than the first film? Half of that film's plot completely revolves around the fact that Marty has to get back to 1985. I can accept that it has more to do with time travel than the third film, which is actually one thing I don't like about the third film. With less of a focus on time travel, it actually feels far less like a Back to the Future film. I now want to cover a few things from the original review as well as the follow-up video, which I didn't get round to covering in the original response. Confused Matthew mentions in his original review that Back to the Future Part 3 was good because it returned to the roots of what made the first film great. As I said in the original video, I don't really see how it returns to the roots of what made the first film great, but whatever. He also says about Part 2 that it has nothing going for it if it's not parasizing off the original, and it has no life of its own. Doesn't that mean that it was returning to the roots of what made the first film great? It seems like a bit of a double standard to me. Why does Part 3 get a pass when it comes to taking things from the original, but Part 2 doesn't? Now, I want to talk about the computer game for Back to the Future that came out a few months ago. In the early stages of the first episode of that game, Biff takes Marty's guitar away from him and messes around with it, and it's only when George tells him to give it back to Marty that he does so. This is further demonstrating the fact that Biff is still a jerk, even in 1985. The only reason he is nice to George is because George has the confidence to stand up to him. This is actually a point in the first film that Matthew seems to have missed completely. George lacked self-confidence. That's why he wouldn't ask Lorraine out to the dance. The change comes at the dance when he tells Biff to leave Lorraine alone. And this newfound self-confidence is further demonstrated by George pushing that ginger-haired guy out of the way when he tries to take Lorraine away from him. And also by the fact that back in 1985 he has had a book published. This newfound self-confidence is the reason Biff is a nice guy in 1985, not because of any retraction from Biff. In fact, if Matthew's theory about Biff's retraction into his natural state of coward were actually true, shouldn't he have retracted into a state of coward when Marty tripped him up in the cafe and then caused him to crash into a manure truck? Speaking of the scene where he crashes into a manure truck, that's another demonstration in the first film of just how bad Biff truly is. Imagine if Marty had not escaped from being rammed into the back of a manure truck. He could have been seriously injured. He could even have been killed. But does Biff care about that? No, because Biff is far more than just a bully. A bully does things that gets you in trouble with a teacher. Biff does things that would get you in trouble with the cops. Matthew actually recently announced that he was planning to review some of his all-time favourite films, and this included the original Back to the Future film. So I'll be interested to see if he talks about this when he does that review. Now moving on to the follow-up video, which I covered in the third part of my response. A couple of things I neglected to mention. Matthew admits that the Biff in alternate 1985 does treat Lorraine in a way that is consistent with his treating of her in the first film, but that is not the case in 1955. I don't see the difference myself, but since the segment in alternate 1985 is a lot longer than the scene in 1955, it seems to me a bit like he's complaining about the glass being half empty. However, he does claim that it wasn't established that Biff wanted to own Lorraine in the first or the second films. All I can say to that is, what did you think Biff meant when he said to Lorraine, "When you going to get it in your head, Lorraine, you're my girl"? Did you think Biff meant she was his daughter or something? He then plays the scenes of Biff and Lorraine from the first film and then the second film, claiming that the difference is night and day. But to be honest, I was really just very impressed watching those two scenes as to how similar the characters' behaviours were from the first and the second films. He also claims that Lorraine is only annoyed by Biff. Well, remind me never to annoy confused Matthew, as clearly, if I do, I'll get kicked in the groin and hit over the head with a cardboard box. As I said in my last video, Biff does not ask Lorraine out to the dance. He pretends to ask her on the off chance that she'll just say yes, but even when she tells Biff she's going to the dance with somebody else, he still insists that she go with him. Someone else also pointed out to me that Matthew's problem with them going back to 1955 isn't that they don't explain why they have to go back to 1955 as opposed to them going to 2015. It's that the film should have been written differently so that we got to see more of 2015. I liked the argument that a film is bad simply because it should have been written differently. It almost seems to me like people are annoyed that the film isn't doing what they want it to do. Any idea can work if the writers put enough effort and thought into it. I would never have imagined that the idea of an old man living in a flying house would have worked as a kids' film, but it did. I would never have thought that the idea of killing off Spock in Star Trek II and then bringing him back in the next film would have worked, but it did. Likewise, the film taking place in 1955 had just as much chance of working as the film taking place in 2015. And if you really think about it, what difference does the setting make to the actual events of the film? If it had all taken place in 2015 rather than 1955, the actual events of the final act of the film would probably have been fairly similar. We would still have had Marty tailing Biff, we would still have had him hiding in the back of his car, we would still have had him sneaking into, probably not Strickland's office, but some boss of Biff's maybe, and trying to steal the sports book only to find that it's just the cover. And we would still have had the final chase scene with Biff on the hoverboard. The only thing that would have been different would have been that it would have all taken place in 2015 rather than 1955. So them going to 2015 wouldn't have actually changed the film at all. Some people have also been echoing Matthew's comments about the alternate 1985, saying that even though it is meant to be a horrible place, they went too far with it, what with everyone having guns and everything. All I can say to that is the same thing that I said in the original response. That's the idea. It's a perfect demonstration of how awful a person Biff truly is, that he would allow Hill Valley to become such a horrible place. He doesn't care who he has to step over, or even step on, in order to get to the top. Another person pointed out to me, in a response to my statement about how sequels are well known for being bad, that there have also been plenty of good sequels. And that is most definitely true. However, there have been a lot more bad sequels, and yet Confused Matthew believes this to be one of the worst sequels ever. My point about there being a lot of bad sequels was not that you should expect a sequel to be bad. You should absolutely hold it to the same standard as you would any other film. It was merely to demonstrate how ludicrous it is to say that it is one of the worst sequels ever, when there have in fact been countless bad sequels far worse than Back to the Future Part 2. If someone gets an A on a science test, it might be fair to say that they are clever. It is another matter entirely to say that they are one of the cleverest people to ever live. Likewise, to say Back to the Future Part 2 is bad might be a fair statement. It is another matter entirely to call it one of the worst sequels ever. Okay, well that's all I have to say about Confused Matthew's review of Back to the Future Part 2, for now at least. If he was to make another follow-up video where he responds to comments about the review, or he goes through with this positive review of the original Back to the Future, you might hear from me again. But for now, that is definitely it. I also recently noticed a comment from my mother, Stan. My mother, Stan?